Welcome to another edition of 1 in 15. As ever, I'm going to let my guests introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Robert Stephenson. I am the Centre Director of Animas Centre for Coaching. I'm also a creative. I trained as an actor, specialising in theatre and education. I also trained as a mime artist. And so I have whenever you've seen me in a physical training space, I'm often moving all over the place and my hands are dancing away because they're kind of used to living their own lives. Yeah, I guess that's me in a nutshell.
Brilliant. I happen to know you just well enough to know that there's a whole other things behind that nutshell, but that'll do for now. So as you know, the point of this has been to think about one big thing that's been dominating people's thinking. What's your big thing?
So the big thing that's dominating my thinking is inclusion. With the sort of the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, that's really enabled us to rethink about what we do as a school and my part in that. Growing up as a black man in London, I've kind of had my fair share of exclusion. And so inclusion has always been a big part of what I've done. It's kind of driven me into theatre and education to enable people to find a voice, to have a voice, to vocalize what's important to them, to develop that confidence. So that's where that piece kind of comes into it. And as a coach, I guess as well, it's always been really important to me that people are included in conversations. I guess some might say that some of the coaching that I do is kind of narrative coaching, and one of my things in that is what's not being said and who's not in this conversation. So inclusion kind of runs through a lot of stuff that I do. And my big thing around inclusion is when you start thinking about inclusion and diversity and who should be at the party and feel safe to be there and air their voice, that just kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the challenge becomes, does this become overwhelming? Does this become too big for the conversation to happen? And do we sort of not give up, but sometimes just feel overwhelmed or overburdened with that, and how, that pushing through, how we continue to push through and have those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating subject. It's so complex, as you said. Like we could start pulling at any one of those threads that you've tempted up before us, and know that there's a rich seam under there.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of I'm really mindful of that kind of adage of, when there's no room at the table for someone, you just get a bigger table. But that kind of thing of, yes, you're right, that it can quickly become overwhelming, and particularly where there's a conversation to be had. You know that if there's too many people in the conversation loses a depth and a richness as well. So what are the particular challenges to do with inclusion that you're facing as?
So for me, for a while, I kind of was looking at the world of coaching, because that's where my focus is right now, because I'm aware that, there are lots of other places that I could look at and could be working with. But I guess I took the decision that to use the position that I have to enable that voice in that space. And I know now for a while that I'd be looking around at various coaching organizations, coaching events that I would attend, and recognize that it wasn't as inclusive as it could be. There wasn't the diverse range of tone, ability, culture, gender that could exist. Sure. And for a long time, I just thought about it and just kind of went, it's like lots of other spaces that I've been in. But then recently I've been like, well, actually something needs to happen with that. Yeah. Somebody needs to begin talking about that. And as I'm in that space, why not begin having those conversations? But as soon as you begin having that conversation, somebody goes, and what about me? Yeah. And what about us? And what about us? And you sort of go, oh, well, I can't talk for you because I don't have your lived experience. So I can invite you into that conversation. But when I start, as you say, as that table gets bigger and you start to invite more and more people, you then go, but where do I start? Yeah. I think part of the challenge is, where do we start? And how do we start with the self? Because I think that's, as a coach, my belief is you've got to start with you and allow it to ripple out from there. But part of the challenge is others going, but what about me? And being pulled into the other's conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's a richness to that. I'm really struck by one of the issues that I've had to wrestle with as I've kind of gone through the coach journey myself is I got very passionate very early on about how potentially the coaching industry was exclusive, actually, because it requires people to have a certain amount of economic capacity, quite often a certain amount of kind of reflective capacity already innate in them. And as somebody with, kind of socialist roots, someone who's worked a lot in the charity and voluntary sector, that level of inclusivity has been really important. So, you've got the ethnic and kind of nationality diversity that you're talking about. Movements like Black Lives Matter have been highlighting really well for us, with complications as well. But there's all these other inclusivities. So you're right. Who are we excluding? We start at level one. Oh, I know I'm excluding this person. The panel is purely white men. Brilliant. We need some women. We need some ethnic groups other than white. Fine. But then we start to notice people who we haven't even noticed weren't there. Yeah, and that gets really complicated really, really quickly.
Well, we all have, I say we all, and I'm sure the coaches will challenge my language there, but there is that unconscious bias that exists. We don't always notice who we're not including.
Yeah.
And that might even come from our own cultural upbringing or our backgrounds or our own socialization. So there might be a part of the community that we're not including, not because we're choosing to exclude, but we haven't recognized or remembered to include them in that conversation. Yeah. And I think one of the challenges that comes with this is when we feel shame for having excluded somebody.
Yeah.
And then that shame creates a defensiveness instead of an inclusiveness, or it creates an over apologeticness.
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast the other day, and the host was interviewing a black woman, and she brought in some stuff around Black Lives Matter, and he was like, yeah, I'm really sorry for the things that I don't know and what I haven't done, and instead doing all this apology, and she was like, yeah, but it's not about that. It's about, once you know better, do better. I can't remember who said that, but there is that. And she was kind of going, you just apologizing about it doesn't create change. No. You creating change creates change. You doing something. So for me, one of the challenges is having these conversations without people feeling shame or embarrassment, but creating an awareness that creates a discussion, that creates change in action and behavior, and an openness to discuss.
Yeah, and that openness is really, really key. I remember. So some of my background is kind of in the church sector and the religious community sector. And I remember a few years ago there was a survey done on why, in particular types of church, black minority leaders just weren't emerging. And it was, there's, as you can imagine, there was a kind of a loaded kind of number of facets around that. But one that really struck me at the time was one where it on one level it was kind of feels really simple, was that the methodology those communities were using to highlight, introduce, encourage and train leaders up wasn't a methodology that in a lot of those cultures and communities was familiar or even welcome. And so what some of those communities had to do was go, we're sorry that we've only had one way of including people. Our way of being has been going, it's an open table. If you can get here, great. If you've got some accessibility that we know about, we'll change that accessibility. But some of those cultures in that context were saying, we don't want to be asked. We don't want to be trained. We want to be given an opportunity in different ways or what have you. And once they recognized that kind of nuance, then that accessibility and that inclusivity began to emerge. Obviously, then the caveat is there's so many years of culture and habit and kind of a track of things happening that barriers are still there. But at least there was an improvement being made.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of what you said earlier about the kind of, class and how coaching kind of falls into a class system.
Yeah.
Because you need the money to do the course. And, one could argue that there are courses that are very cheap, and one might argue that those courses aren't very good. And if you look at the sort of the more established courses, there is a price tag attached to them that if you don't have a disposable income or a funding stream, that it's not going to work for you.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we've looked at as well, is going, well, what's our part in creating a more inclusive coaching community? on the larger scale, because I think as an organization, when I speak about Animas as an organization, I see inclusivity there. I see diversity there. But I don't necessarily see it on the boards of other coaching schools or organizations. And, we all make our choice about what our board is made up on. So I'm not saying they have to, but I guess I'm saying that people don't arrive in those places because they can't even do the training to get there in the first place. So one of the things that we're looking at is, well, do we create a scholarship fund? Do we create a funding pool that allows people, when we think about class, to have access to the training so that they can then be part of that pool and they can be part of that voice? And I was talking to a lady the other day who I'm doing some work with, a woman called Myra Khan, and she talks about intersectionality, which was something I just hadn't heard of, which in our conversations was quite amusing, that I was talking about, inclusion, and she started talking about intersectionality, and I was like, well, what's this? And she was like, well, where all these pieces overlay and how we can be excluded through those intersections of society that we don't necessarily consider. And I suddenly went, okay, so, if you are, from a diverse if you're from an ethnic background and from a low income family, you're doubly hit, if not 10 times hit, by your ability to get into this work, into this field. So how do we give access to that? And what's the work that we might need to do to enable that to happen, whether that's scholarship fund, whether that's free training within certain sectors, whether it's working with organizations that work within those sectors to offer training. So we're finding a way to work with one who can work with the many, and filter it in that way.
Yeah. So, and that's, I say, it's like you said earlier, that it's really complex, isn't it? You can start to identify one or two first steps that you can take, but that you're stepping into a void on some levels, that there's no hard and fast way of predicting where the next step is going to be or what the next appropriate step is going to be. I'm doing a bit of work with a company at the moment who outsource coaching with people, and one of the things that attracted me to them was that they have a policy where if they approach a company and say, we'll offer your company employees coaching, their policy is, but it needs to be at every level of the organization. It can't just be for the CEOs or the board. It's got to be for the entry-level people as well. Obviously reflecting back on what I said earlier, that really attracted me. I was thinking, because that's the other thing about, and obviously, ethnic and social class are big factors in this, in accessing those things. But there's so many people out there who would value and achieve a great impact from coaching or similar tools, but they don't think they're worth it. And they financially or time wise or kind of momentum wise, they just can't afford it. They can't find ways of accessing it. It's quite a challenge, I think, to all of us in the industry.
Yeah, I really love this idea that if you're going to work in an organization, you've got to work with the whole organization. It reminds me of some of the work that Sonia Gill does, and she does work around outstanding schools, or creating outstanding schools and outstanding cultures within schools. And she's like, I'll come and work with your school, but we'll work with the whole school. I'm not just going to work with part of it, but let's work the whole school, but also let's make sure that we get the senior leadership involved in this work, because if they're not involved and seeing the benefit of the work, then how are we going to get this through the whole kind of system, as it were? So there's something here as well, as we're talking about this, that I sort of go, there's this to wrestle with, which is the systems that we work within and how they, through their very existence, create exclusion or prevent inclusion or diversity to exist within them, not through any fault of the individual, but through the fault of the system's creation and it not having the leeway or the flexibility to think outside of itself, to notice who's not there and who's not involving, and why they're not being and why they're not involving themselves in that system or in that change.
Sure. That's all fascinating stuff. Now, you won't be surprised to know we're pretty much bang out of time. We've included a lot of possibility. I think at least one of the things I'm taking from this is, don't worry too much about what you're not able to do. Try and do the thing that you can do. What else? What else is a message of kind of hope and possibility that you want to leave us with?
I think that the thing is this, I definitely think you've got to start with self and connect with others. So one of the things that I've done is looked at, so who am I? I'm, you know, and what's my position? So who can I help and what can I do? So part of what I've done is I've started a BAME coaches network.
Yeah.
For coaches from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups to come together and look at, well, what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, how can we support and how can we educate? So there's, you know, start with self and connect with others. So create connections. And I think, you know, connections are the things that enable us to create momentum. So, you know, the more people I can speak to about this, the more people that will speak to others and share their voice, I think that's the way that we're going to create change. And that's where hope lies for me.
Brilliant. Robert, you've been an amazing guest. Thank you very much. I'm sure, well, I know I want to go away and think about more to do with this, recognizing both the, you know, the things that are possible for me and also some of the challenges. I'm really thinking about, you know, who am I excluding without even knowing that I'm doing that. But Robert Stephenson, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Cheers.